In the last two videos, we saw a couple of techniques which included an element of winding. Today we'll be investigating winding a little further to see how these turning movements of the blade are used within Meyer's system. We'll begin with a very brief look at a typical winding movement with the point. Most of us are very comfortable with this point-centric approach. However, we shouldn't forget the use of the cut, which we'll look at today. Whichever part of the blade you're attacking with, there's a certain amount of structural isomorphism between all of these techniques. They all rely on a turning of the body and the hip, with an accompanying hand motion to generate power and structure. Let's start with the simplest and most often forgotten types of winding, exemplified in doubling and the blind strike. In both of these techniques, we've entered into a bind with our opponent from our right side against their left. If the opponent parries strongly and maintains blade contact, we wind to our upper right, accompanied by a hip motion or a step, and attack them behind their blade at their head. Notice that Meyer advocates using the false edge of the blade for this attack. You can also use the true edge as advocated in other sources. The body mechanic is the same between the two, however the false edge cut tends to lead to a high hand position, while the true edge cut allows for a lower hand position at the conclusion of the technique. When we contrast this with the blind strike, we see the movements of the hands and body are very similar. However, instead of cutting behind the blade, as the Duplieren does, the blind strike cuts outside the blade to the head. Notice the slight winding to the left which sets up the blind strike. This often happens inadvertently when you're attempting a thrust, and then you have to wind to the outside in response to a parry. The winding described in Meyer's handworks is a natural follow-on to a blind strike or a doubling. It includes attacks with both edges of your blade while staying on one side of your opponent's blade. We begin with its Duplieren against an attack from above. In response to the opponent's blade pressure, we wind up to the right with a doubling action. If they parry this or attack the opening, we wind back out, covering with its Duplieren and then withdrawing. I like to encourage people to keep their hands in line with the centerline of their body, shoulders and hips as they perform these actions. This not only provides structural stability, but it also allows the movements to be driven by the whole body instead of just the arms. As always, the situation should dictate what footwork you use. Springing, stepping or winding in place are all acceptable. Notice here that the entire technique is towards my opponent's left side. I'm not moving around the blade, I'm keeping blade contact on one side of it as I wind. Our tactile reaction times are slightly higher than our visual reaction times, so maintaining blade contact gives us a very good early indicator of our opponent's intentions. While performing your windings, pay careful attention to good structure, including turning of the hips and the body in the movement. As I've advocated before, we can make the movements slightly faster and more efficient by taking out the large extraneous motions. We can explore this by contrasting a large expressive motion with a tighter, more controlled action. In this first example, we're using large flowing cuts relying on momentum. Now let's see a tighter winding, which keeps the point closer to the opponent and the hands more centrally located. The difference between the two actions is quite subtle, however that minor advantage in speed can make a big difference when you're actually fencing. This isn't to say that one method is objectively better than the other, just slightly more optimized for a specific task. In the end, the context of your fencing will determine which variant you actually use. A second example of winding comes from later in Meyer's longsword text. This winding happens on the opposite side of the opponent's blade, beginning from a low guard and including some slightly different body motions. As the opponent attacks from above, we lift our blade, coming up with the flat to parry in a horizontal position. From here, we wind out to the outside with a lean, and as they parry or attack our opening, we cut away with a winding to the other side. As I perform the parry and then wind out, you'll notice I lean away. This helps to minimize the exposure to the opponent's blade if they choose to attack directly down the line. The final winding back to my right is actually nothing more than a Schildhau with crossed hands, as described by Meyer. By catching the opponent's blade on the flat part of my strong, I ensure that my parry is structurally sound, but also the closer pivot point to the hands allows me to wind in and out much more quickly. As a final point, let's talk about winding through. Winding through is more closely related to grappling, but is included in Meyer's winding section in his text. Because of the shortening of the blade, winding takes place at a closer distance to longer cuts such as Oberhaus. If the opponent gets too close, we can actually wind through with our pommel over or between our opponent's arms to grapple their hands, take them out of the way and cut to the face. If we're feeling particularly ambitious, we can do this with a half-swording action. This is almost certain to impress your friends and win you fame throughout the land. However, it may not be the most practical application in the world. Hopefully this helps with your understanding of winding in the context of Meyer. Thanks for watching.